Yeah, because you did a similar poll back in June, basically asking Kenyans whether they felt the country was going in the wrong direction. There's a decline from how they felt in June, or rather July, to September. What informed that shift? What was happening?
That is, compared to June, the most recent survey, correct, showed, I think, a decline in those thinking the country was going in the wrong direction by nearly 20%, which means an improvement. I don't have the other figure. Well, I think there are several factors that were involved. Excuse me. One is, I think recently, in the last month at least, there's been largely an absence of demonstrations, protests, the response of the police, and so on. We saw in an earlier clip the deaths that have been attributed to police violence and so on. One factor. I think also that survey that was done at the end of June, although I can't prove this, the data collection ended on the last day of the month, one day before the new Finance Act was supposed to take effect. And I think, especially with regard to the housing levy, most Kenyans were thinking, and I have the data, but I don't have time to look it up, far more Kenyans were expecting to be subjected to that 1.5% than actually turned out to be the case. So that, I think there's been a kind of a calming effect. Even if the case, certain aspects of the Finance Act are in court, as we saw today. Also, on the other side of the demonstrations, the reconciliation talks have taken off. So I think these other factors help to, and also perhaps, again, I can't prove it, but the very, very positive publicity that the president got last week at the climate conference, just before we started our interviews. Now, we didn't ask people, are you aware of a climate conference? How do you evaluate the president's performance, for those who are aware? So we didn't track that. But I think those are some of the factors that led to the more positive estimation of the country's direction. There are several other things I could add later, but just one I'd like to add now. We had a discussion a few moments ago about how much of the food that Kenyans eat actually comes from shops as opposed to shambas, whether their own or relatives or whatever. And we did ask this question in June. We found that only 29% of Kenyans say that all of their food, or most of it, comes from a shamba. Only 24% said none of it comes from a shamba. So I think the point that was made by one of the CSs is that when we're looking at, I'm not saying that the price of unga in the shops is not important, and we have the figures which obviously show that in the urban population is much more dependent on bought staple of unga than people in rural areas. But it is definitely a mixture, and that was even in the aftermath of this long drought. So when people are complaining about basic commodities, we have to dig deeper and find out what proportion of their table food is actually coming from shops versus shambas.
I'll bring Caroline in a bit later on that issue of what the government has prioritized in terms of promises, because we've heard a lot about the economy being on the back foot, the need to be in recovery over the last year. So I'll come back to you, but let's quickly cross over to Kibra, where Chamtai Goin and Waweru are standing by with the conversation there.
Thank you, Vicky. It doesn't get any better.